The day my husband fired me in front of over 100 employees was the same day I became his boss. Spencer stood at the front of the hall and dropped a folder on the table. He said I had failed, that I had let a shipment of faulty surgical instruments reach a hospital network and endangered the company's most valuable client. He called me a liability. He told security to collect my badge. Then, standing beside the woman he had been seeing for months, he said I was no longer welcome at Lakefront Clinical Supply. I didn't argue. I simply looked at him and asked one question. "Are you sure this is your final decision?" Spencer laughed. What he didn't know was that 3 hours earlier, at 7:15 that morning, I had signed the papers making me the sole legal owner of everything he was standing in. If you're new here, this channel is where real stories live. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. I want to tell you how it started, not with the firing, but long before that, with a man who walked into a company his father built and decided that inheriting something was the same as earning it. Wesley Carver spent over 30 years building Lakefront Clinical Supply into a trusted name in Midwest medical distribution. He knew every supplier by first name, knew which hospitals needed early delivery windows before flu season hit, knew that in this industry, a single shipment error didn't just cost money, it cost someone their chance at a safe surgery. When Wesley died, Spencer inherited the company, the building near Lake Michigan, the client roster, and the title. What he didn't inherit was his father's understanding of what made it all work. Spencer was better at the performance of leadership than the practice of it. He could command a room at a conference, shake hands with investors, and give quotes to local business press that made Lakefront sound like it was thriving. But put him in front of a compliance report or a supplier renegotiation, and he would go quiet in a way that looked confident to people who didn't know better. I had been watching that particular silence for years. I came to Lakefront the way most people come to jobs that end up defining them without expecting it to matter so much. I started in inventory, checking stock levels, flagging items approaching expiration, cross-referencing delivery records against purchase orders. It wasn't glamorous, but my grandmother June had raised me to believe that the unglamorous work was usually the work that kept people alive. In medical supply, she was right. I moved up steadily, and within a few years I was running operations, vendor contracts, quality control, timelines, distribution, logistics, emergency order, coordination. Spencer gave me the responsibilities without ever quite giving me the title to match. When he introduced me at industry dinners, he would say, "This is my wife Elise. She helps out with some of the back-end stuff." I learned to smile at that and say nothing. My grandmother, June Merritt, had worked as a supply manager at a small community hospital for most of her adult life. She was the kind of woman who kept a handwritten ledger even after the hospital switched to digital systems, because she didn't trust that the software would catch everything a careful eye would. She taught me that in healthcare, the people standing under the bright lights in the operating room get the credit, but it's the people checking expiration dates in the stockroom at midnight who keep the lights on in the first place. When she passed, the only thing I asked to keep was a small brass key she'd carried for years, the key to the hospital supply room where she'd spent her career. I've kept it in my coat pocket ever since as a reminder that certain kinds of work don't announce themselves. They just quietly hold everything together. About 4 years ago, I realized our inventory tracking system was dangerously outdated. We were managing thousands of product lines across multiple distribution points, and the software we used couldn't reliably flag regulatory recalls or cross-reference lot numbers with expiration data in real time. I put together a proposal and brought it to Spencer. He looked it over for about 45 seconds before setting it down and telling me that I wasn't an engineer, that software development was outside my lane, and that I should focus on what I was good at. Then he added, with the particular kind of smile that men use when they think they're being kind, that maybe I could look into updating the break room. I didn't argue with him. I went home, opened my laptop, and started making calls. It took me the better part of a year, working evenings and weekends, to build the foundation of what would become Merit Compliance Labs, a platform designed specifically to track medical inventory flag products approaching expiration and alert distribution managers to active regulatory recalls before those products ever left a warehouse. I named it after my grandmother. I hired a small development team, kept the incorporation documents under Merit Holdings, a separate entity I had quietly established, and I said nothing to Spencer about any of it. He had told me the idea wasn't worth pursuing. I decided to find out for myself. Within 2 years, Merit Compliance Labs had paying clients independent clinics, regional hospital systems, smaller supply companies that couldn't afford enterprise-level software, but desperately needed what our platform offered. Within 3 years, it was generating more revenue than I had ever drawn in salary from Lakefront. Spencer knew I was doing something with software in the same vague way he knew I handled logistics and vendor negotiations as background noise that kept the operation running without requiring his attention. He never asked for details. That was one of Spencer's defining qualities. He only asked questions about things he thought reflected well on him. By the time our marriage was falling apart in any real sense, I had already accepted that it had been hollow for longer than I wanted to admit. I noticed the shift in Spencer, before I had evidence of it, the way he started taking longer to answer texts, the new interest he took in Kendra Blythe's opinions at meetings. Kendra had joined as Director of Strategic Development about 18 months prior, and she was skilled at the things Spencer valued most. She made him feel visionary. She framed every cautious decision I made as an obstacle to growth, and every reckless shortcut he wanted to take as bold leadership. Spencer's mother, Marjorie, adored her. Marjorie had never warmed to me. She found me too focused on operational details, not polished enough for what she considered the Carver family's standing in Milwaukee. With Kendra in the picture, Marjorie had someone to compare me to in the way she had always wanted. I knew about the affair before I had proof of it. I didn't confront Spencer because by then, I wasn't trying to save the marriage. I was trying to save something more important. The staff who came to work at Lakefront every day and the hospitals that depended on us to get their supply chains right. I had watched Spencer's decision-making deteriorate for years, and I knew that without intervention, the company was heading toward a collapse that would hurt people who had nothing to do with his choices or mine. The order from St. Arlene Health Network arrived on a Tuesday. They were preparing for a high-volume cardiac surgery period and needed several thousand units of sterile surgical instruments delivered on a strict timeline. It was a significant contract, one of the largest active accounts we had. When I reviewed the supplier documentation for the fulfillment batch, I found that a portion of the inventory had been sourced from a new vendor whose quality certification process hadn't been completed. The instruments hadn't cleared the full compliance verification. I sent a written notice to Spencer, to Kendra, and to the rest of the management team stating clearly that the batch could not be shipped until certification was finalized. 2 days later, the shipment went out anyway. I found out because I received an automated alert from our tracking system, the same outdated system I had been trying to replace, flagging the departure. When I traced it back, I found that the compliance status in the system had been changed. The modification had been made after my warning, and it hadn't been made from my account. St. Arlene's receiving team flagged the discrepancy almost immediately. A portion of the instruments failed their internal inspection. They returned the entire shipment and notified us that they were reviewing the contract relationship and considering a report to the relevant regulatory body. Spencer had staked that delivery on the bank meeting he had scheduled for the following week, where he needed to show incoming revenue to keep the credit line from being called. Instead, he walked into that meeting with a returned shipment and a threatened contract. He called the all-hands meeting for the following morning. The entire staff assembled in the main hall, the large open space near the front of the building that had once been used as a product showroom when Wesley was still running things. Spencer took the floor and told them that a critical quality failure had occurred under the watch of the person responsible for operations. He said that Lakefront's most important client relationship had been jeopardized because of inadequate oversight. He didn't say my name for the first 2 minutes. He built to it slowly, the way people do when they want the accusation to land with weight. I sat in the third row and listened. I had the email chain in my phone. I had the timestamps. I had the server log showing exactly when that compliance code was changed and from which account. I started to stand when Spencer finished his opening remarks, intending to walk him through it point by point in front of everyone. He cut me off before I had finished my first sentence. He said this wasn't a debate, that management had reviewed the situation and that the decision had been made. His voice carried the calm of a man who believes he is untouchable. Kendra stood to his left, wearing an expression of practiced disappointment. Marjorie sat in the front row. I hadn't even known she would be there, and said loudly enough for the rows around her to hear that Spencer should have made this decision long ago. Renee Dalton, who had been running quality control for 6 years and knew every detail of what had actually happened, rose from her seat 2 rows behind me. I could see in her face exactly what she was about to do. I turned and gave a small shake of my head. She looked at me for a moment, then sat back down. Spencer announced that my access would be revoked immediately and that Kendra would assume operational oversight on an interim basis. He nodded to the security officer near the door. The officer walked over and waited. The room was very quiet, in the way rooms get when everyone is holding their breath and hoping not to be noticed. I looked at Spencer. I thought about June, about that brass key, about the 1,000 small decisions I had made over the years that had kept this company functioning, while Spencer collected the credit for its survival. I thought about the papers I had signed at 7:15 that morning in Owen Keats's office, and the folder now sitting in Owen's briefcase. "Are you sure this is your final decision?" I asked. Spencer smiled a wide, easy smile, the kind he used at charity dinners. He said yes. He said I had no standing left in this company. I unclipped my badge and set it on the table in front of me. Then I walked out of the hall through the main corridor and into the parking lot, where the morning air off the lake was cold and sharp against my face. I didn't look back. I sat in my car for a few minutes, not deciding whether to go back, because Owen and I had already planned for this possibility. Not hoped for it, but planned for it the way you prepare an umbrella before the forecast turns, knowing you may never need to open it. The documents were ready. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock. What I was deciding now was simpler and harder at the same time, whether I was willing to walk back into that building and own what came next, not just on paper, but in every way that would follow for as long as this company existed. Spencer was planning to push through a plan that afternoon to lay off nearly 40 employees, shut down the quality control division, and sell the Northern Distribution Center to a buyer that Kendra had been quietly steering him toward. If I walked away and let the afternoon proceed, the damage would be irreversible before morning. People would lose jobs. Assets would be transferred, and the mess that Spencer and Kendra had created together would be buried under a restructuring plan that made it look like I had been the problem all along. I pulled out my phone and called Owen. "I'll be there at 2, I said. He already knew what that meant. I started the car and drove back toward the lake. While I was driving back toward the lake, Spencer was moving fast. By the time I had pulled out of the parking lot that morning, he had already instructed the IT department to revoke my system credentials, remove my name from the management directory, and transfer administrative access to Kendra across every platform I had built over the past 5 years. I learned this later from Renee, who had stayed at her desk and watched it happen in real time, access levels changing names, disappearing from shared drives, the quiet digital erasure of someone who had just been declared inconvenient. Spencer had done it with the efficiency of a man who had been planning it for longer than one morning. Kendra, for her part, was already presenting what she called a stabilization framework to Spencer before the board meeting even began. The plan called for laying off 38 employees from operations and logistics, shutting down the quality control division entirely, and selling the Northern Distribution Center to a company called Bridgepoint Industrial Partners, a buyer she described as a strong value offer in a difficult market. Spencer had reviewed it for approximately the same amount of time he had once spent reviewing my software proposal. Then he signed off on it. What Spencer didn't know, what he had never thought to investigate because Kendra had made sure he never had a reason to, was that Bridgepoint Industrial Partners had a financial arrangement with Kendra that predated her employment at Lakefront by nearly a year. She had not come to rebuild the company. She had come to weaken it strategically, transfer its best assets at below market value to a competitor, and walk away with a payment that would never appear on any document bearing Spencer's signature. It was a clean plan, and it would have worked if the board meeting had proceeded the way Spencer intended. It didn't proceed that way. Owen and I arrived at 10 minutes before 2. The building's head of security met us in the lobby. He had received the ownership transfer documentation from Owen's office that morning, well before the all-hands meeting, and he had spent the intervening hours reading it carefully. When Spencer had instructed him to revoke my building access, he had quietly noted that the person issuing that instruction no longer held the authority to do so. He didn't say anything to Spencer about that. He just waited. The board had already assembled when we walked into the conference room. Spencer was at the head of the table, Kendra to his right, Marjorie seated along the wall behind him. Not a board member, but present in the way she always was when Spencer wanted a visible show of family solidarity. He looked up when the door opened, and for a fraction of a second, I saw something cross his face that wasn't anger. It was confusion. He had believed completely that I was gone. "You need to leave," Spencer said. His voice was steady, but his jaw had tightened in the way it did when something wasn't going according to his expectations. Nobody moved to escort me out. Owen set a document folder on the table and introduced himself to the board members who didn't already know him. He explained in the measured tone of a man who had delivered this kind of information before that as of 7:15 that morning, controlling interest in Lakefront Clinical Supply had been transferred to Merit Holdings, LLC, through the acquisition of the primary debt position, the majority of voting shares and key operational assets, including the building, the warehouse facilities, and the distribution infrastructure. He laid the documentation font in front of each board member in turn. Spencer's reaction was immediate and loud. He said Merit Holdings was an outside firm taking advantage of a company in a vulnerable position, that the acquisition was predatory, and that the board had no obligation to recognize it. He looked to Marjorie, who had risen slightly from her chair. He looked to the board members he believed were loyal to him. Most of them were looking at the documents. I reached into my coat pocket and set my grandmother's brass key on the table. "Merit Holdings was founded and is solely owned by me," I said. "The name comes from my grandmother, June Merritt. The funding came from Merit Compliance Labs, the software platform you told me wasn't worth my time." The room went quiet in a way that felt different from the silence in the main hall that morning. That silence had been the silence of people afraid to speak. This one was the silence of people recalculating. Spencer said it wasn't possible. He said I was his wife, that any business I had built during our marriage was subject to marital asset considerations, and that he would have the transaction reviewed immediately. Owen walked him through the provisions of the financial management agreement that Spencer had signed 3 years prior. a document that had established Merit Holdings as a legally independent entity protected from marital asset claims under terms that had been disclosed to Spencer at signing. Spencer had not read it carefully at the time. He had been in a hurry to get to a lunch meeting and had told his own attorney to summarize it for him later. Later had apparently never come. I watched Spencer absorb that. I watched him understand in real time that the agreement he had dismissed as routine paperwork had been the document that made everything I had built unreachable to him, and that his own indifference had made it possible. There was nothing theatrical about that moment. It was just the ordinary consequence of not paying attention. I then walked the board through the email chain from the St. Arlene situation, the warning I had sent, the timestamps, the names of every recipient. Owen presented the server log data showing that the compliance certification had been altered after my warning from an account belonging to Kendra at a time when I had already been explicitly locked out of the approval chain. Spencer had not authorized a shipment despite my objections. He had authorized a shipment after Kendra had manually overridden the compliance flag I had raised. The board members were quiet as they reviewed it. Spencer said I was manipulating the record. He said it with less conviction than he'd said anything else that afternoon. I told the board that the firing Spencer had carried out that morning was not legally enforceable because he had not held operational authority at the time he issued it. I told them I had no intention of returning to my previous role. I would be assuming the position of executive chair effective immediately as the controlling owner of the company. And I told the staff watching through the glass walls of that conference room, Renee and the others who had gathered in the corridor, when word spread that something was happening, that no one would be losing their jobs under the plan that had just been placed in front of the board. Marjorie stood up from her chair along the wall. She looked at Spencer, then at me, then at the document folder on the table. Something moved behind her eyes. Not regret exactly, but the specific stillness of a person who has just realized that the version of events they committed to was not the version that was true. She picked up her coat and walked out of the room without looking back. She had been the loudest voice in that building for years about what I wasn't, what I didn't have, what I would never be for the Carver name. And she left without a single word. I noted that, and then I returned my attention to the room because the board was still in session and there was work left to do. The board voted to recognize the transfer. I expected to feel something clean at that moment, relief maybe, or the particular satisfaction of a plan that had worked. Instead, what I felt was the immediate weight of what came next, because Kendra had already moved. Renee found me in the hallway 20 minutes after the vote and told me what she'd seen. Kendra had slipped out during the board session, and the security footage showed her leaving the building with a personal hard drive. The data she had copied included our complete client pricing structures, supplier contract terms, and the full contact list for every hospital and clinic we serviced. More damaging was what Renee had uncovered by pulling call logs. Kendra had spent the past 6 weeks in direct communication with the procurement directors at 3 of our largest hospital accounts, telling them that Lakefront was heading toward insolvency and that she could facilitate their transition to a new supplier. That new supplier was a competitor with ties to Bridgepoint, the same company she'd been steering Spencer toward all along. The structural damage Kendra had done to our client relationships was not something a board vote could undo. Trust in this industry didn't transfer with paperwork. The regulatory situation made it worse. The state agency that oversees medical device distribution had received St. Arlen's report by the time I got back to my office that afternoon. They issued a preliminary notice requiring Lakefront to suspend distribution of all products from the non-certified supplier batch, pending a compliance review. A suspension, even a partial one, meant that nearly half our active revenue would stop moving while the investigation ran its course. Our remaining suppliers were already calling about overdue balances that Spencer had deferred for months to manage cash flow optics. The emergency audit I ordered came back the next morning, and the numbers were worse than my most conservative projections. Kendra had routed payments to a consulting firm run by a close associate fees for strategic services that had never been rendered. Spencer's electronic signature was on every approval. He had signed what he was given without verifying what it was, and the pattern went back almost 18 months. Renee came to find me late that evening. Most of the building had emptied. She sat across from me in what was now technically my office and told me plainly that the responsible move might be to wind down operations, liquidate the physical assets at fair value, and protect merit compliance labs from being pulled into the financial fallout. She wasn't wrong. The logic was sound, and she was saying it because she cared about the outcome, not because she wanted to discourage me. I didn't answer her right away. I walked through the building instead, through the main floor, through the corridor that led to the warehouse. I pushed open the heavy side door and stood in the storage area where we kept the temperature-controlled inventory. The lights were on their automatic dim cycle, and the space was quiet except for the low hum of the climate systems. I put my hand in my coat pocket and felt the brass key the same way I had been doing since I was 23 years old. I thought about what it would mean to close this place not symbolically, but practically. The clinics in rural Wisconsin that ordered from us because we were the only distributor who carried their specific product lines at reliable delivery windows. The logistics team members who had been here for a decade, who had stayed through every wave of Spencer's mismanagement because they believed the company itself was worth staying for. I thought about what it meant to hold the key to something and choose to lock it rather than tend to what was inside. Meanwhile, Spencer had gone back to the executive floor after the board meeting and refused to leave. He told anyone who would listen that I had engineered a theft of his family's legacy, that I had used our marriage as cover to strip the company away from him. A few of the longer-tenured employees were wavering not because they believed Spencer's version, but because Lakefront had always been a Carver company in their minds, and the reordering of that reality was disorienting. That was the thing I hadn't fully accounted for when I signed those papers at 7:15 in the morning. Ownership on paper is a legal fact. Legitimacy in a room full of people who have worked somewhere for years is something you have to earn in real time. I had the rights. I didn't yet have the trust. And in a company whose entire value depended on whether hospitals believed we would do what we said we would do, trust was the only asset that actually mattered. I stood in that warehouse for a long time. I had won the thing I had spent months positioning to win, and I had won it on the same day it was closest to being worth nothing. Not a dramatic turning point with a clear direction forward, but a genuine threshold where the right choice was genuinely hard, and where making the wrong one would take down not just me, but everyone who had stayed when they didn't have to. I had one decision left to make. I walked back toward the light. The next morning I called everyone back to the same hall where Spencer had fired me 24 hours earlier. People have asked me since why I didn't use a different room, somewhere neutral, somewhere that didn't carry what that space carried. The answer is that I needed the room to mean something different by the time I was done. I needed the people standing in it to have a new memory to attach to those walls, and the only way to create that was to go back and do something different in the same place. I stood at the front, without notes, at the same level as everyone else rather than behind the podium Spencer had always used. I told them the truth, not a version that centered my grievances against Spencer or my documentation against Kendra, but the operational truth that mattered most. Lakefront Clinical Supply had shipped a non-certified product batch to St. Arlen Health Network. A portion of those instruments had not met the required standard. That had happened under our name regardless of who had falsified the compliance record or who had signed the approval. The company was responsible, and I was now the person in charge of the company. I told them we would be initiating a voluntary full recall of all products from that supplier batch across every account that had received them. We would cover the cost of replacement sourcing for every affected hospital. We would file a complete and unredacted disclosure with the regulatory agency and cooperate with their review without condition. All of it before the end of the week. The room was very still while I said it. Some faces showed relief. Others held the careful neutrality of people who had been promised things before and were waiting to see whether this time was different. I told them no one would be laid off. The Quality Control Division would not be closed. It would be expanded, and Renee Dalton would lead it with the authority and the budget that role had always deserved. Anyone who wanted to leave would receive full severance and a reference from me personally. Anyone who stayed would be part of rebuilding something worth rebuilding, not because it had a family name attached to it, but because the hospitals we supplied were real, and the patients in those hospitals were real. And the work of getting safe products to operating rooms on time was exactly the kind of work my grandmother had spent her life doing without ever being asked to stand at the front of a room and be thanked for it. Most people stayed. Renee found me afterward and handed me a coffee without saying anything for a moment. Then she told me the warehouse team had already started pulling the recall inventory. They hadn't waited to be asked. They had just started. That told me more about the state of the company and about who had actually been holding it together all along than any financial report could have. The voluntary recall cost us significantly, not just in the direct expense of replacement sourcing, but in the signal it sent to the market during a period when we were already under regulatory review and already bleeding client confidence. But it was the only decision that was true to why I had bought the company in the first place. I hadn't acquired Lakefront to protect an investment. I had acquired it because I knew that without intervention, the people running it would eventually put someone's patient at risk, and I was the only person positioned to stop that from happening. The recall was the first real proof that the ownership transfer had changed something that mattered. Using Merit Compliance Labs, I built what I came to call a live accountability layer across our entire distribution operation. Every product that left our warehouse would carry a digital tracking record, accessible in real time to the receiving hospital, origin documentation, certification status, expiration, data lot number, and a direct cross-reference to any active regulatory recall flags. Every change to a compliance status required dual authorization with a time-stamped audit trail. No single administrator could alter a record unilaterally the way Kendra had done. The system wasn't perfect on day one, but it was more transparent than anything else in the regional market, and transparency, I had learned, was its own form of competitive advantage when the industry standard was opacity. Spencer refused to vacate the executive floor for nearly a week. He continued telling staff that I had stolen what belonged to his family, that the acquisition would be challenged. His own attorney eventually advised him to stop making public statements, and after that, the floor went quiet. Owen walked me through what litigation against Spencer would look like, the timeline, the cost, the likelihood of recovery given that most of his personal assets were already leveraged against debts he'd accumulated maintaining a lifestyle the company couldn't support. I sat with that for 2 days. Then I told Owen to focus our legal resources on the regulatory process and the Kendra matter instead. Removed Spencer from every management role and revoked his authority to represent the company in any capacity. I gave him a reasonable window to collect his belongings from the office his father had once occupied, and I did not remove Wesley Carver's name from the building directory or from the company's founding documentation. Wesley had built something real here with real effort over 30 years. Spencer had nearly destroyed it, but that didn't erase what his father had made. The distinction mattered to me, and I thought it needed to be visible. News about Kendra came on a Thursday morning, about 2 weeks after the board meeting. She had been stopped at Mitchell International Airport with a personal hard drive, along with documentation that investigators connected to her financial arrangement with Bridgepoint Industrial Partners. Owen's office had provided the supporting material to the relevant authorities the week prior. When the message came through, I was in the middle of a call with a supplier. I set the phone down on the desk and looked out the window at the parking lot below for a moment. I had expected to feel something more defined satisfaction, maybe, or the relief of a loose end finally resolved. What I actually felt was a particular kind of tiredness. Kendra's plan had been deliberate and well constructed, but it had grown in the space that Spencer's carelessness had opened. She hadn't created the vulnerability. She had simply identified it and decided to use it. That was a kind of damage that wouldn't be resolved by one arrest, because the conditions that made it possible the willingness of people in positions of authority to not ask questions as long as they liked the answers they were getting. Those conditions didn't leave with one person. I turned back to my desk and kept working. The regulatory review ran for just over 5 months. Every information request was answered within 48 hours. 2 unannounced facility inspections were completed without incident. Owen called our compliance submission the most thorough voluntary disclosure he had seen in 20 years of healthcare work. The agency restored our full distribution license in the 6th month with a formal notation that the compliance failures identified had been attributable to conduct predating the current ownership structure. I framed the letter and put it in the hallway outside the Quality Control Division, not in the lobby where clients would see it, but in the hallway where Renee's team walked past it every morning. Several clients Kendra had been working to redirect came back within the first year, not because we asked them to, but because the hospitals she had steered toward competitors began encountering the kinds of inventory and certification problems our system was built to prevent. The platform had become a market differentiator in a way I hadn't initially designed for. Lakefront was no longer the largest distributor in the region, but by every measurable standard, it had become one of the most reliable. I moved my own office down from the top floor and set up in a space adjacent to the Quality Control Center. People assumed it was symbolic. It wasn't. Being close to the verification process meant that any decision I made about a shipment or a supplier required me to physically walk past the people who would catch the error if I got it wrong. That proximity was a discipline, and I needed it as much as anyone. Spencer left Milwaukee about 4 months after the board meeting. He relocated to another city and eventually took a sales management position with a small distribution firm. He sent letters, several of them, over the course of that first year, asking for some form of acknowledgement, some path back to a version of things that no longer existed. I read each one and didn't reply. The absence of anger in me surprised me sometimes. There was no performance of forgiveness involved. I simply had nothing left to say to him, and I had learned to trust that feeling when it arrived. A letter from Marjorie came near the end of that first year. Handwritten, which surprised me. It wasn't an apology. I don't think she had the architecture for one of those, and I wasn't looking for it. She had written one sentence Wesley would have been grateful. I read it twice, folded it along its original crease, and put it in the drawer where I kept things that were true but didn't require a response. It was enough. It was more than I had expected from her, and I let it be what it was. The first annual company meeting under the new structure was held in the main hall, the same space where I had been fired, where I had come back, where I had stood the following morning, and told the full truth to everyone who needed to hear it. This time the chairs were arranged so that there was no elevated position at the front. Renee opened the meeting. She presented the compliance numbers for the year, the client retention data, and the result of our most recent independent safety audit. Then she announced that St. Arlen Health Network had renewed their contract after completing the most rigorous vendor verification process in the hospital system's history. The room applauded, and the sound of it in that hall felt like something being set right. I didn't stand up to take credit. I asked the people who had built the new system, the warehouse staff, the quality verification team, the logistics coordinators who had restructured our delivery protocols from the ground up to stand instead. Most of them looked slightly uncomfortable being acknowledged, which told me they were exactly the right people for the work. After the meeting ended and the hall cleared, I walked the building the way I sometimes did, at the end of a long day, through the main floor, down the side corridor, into the warehouse. The afternoon shift was still active, and the space was bright and busy in the way it should be. At the back wall near the door that led to the dock, I had mounted the brass key in a small shadow box. Simple frame, no label. I had moved it there 6 months earlier when I realized I no longer needed to carry it in my pocket to remember what it meant. I thought about June, about what she would have made of all of it. She would not have been interested in the drama. She would have asked about the recall process. She would have wanted to know whether the new compliance system caught everything it was supposed to catch, and whether the people running it had what they needed to do the job. She would have walked through this warehouse the same way she walked through hers, not looking for recognition, just checking that everything that needed to be in order was in order. Spencer had fired me to prove he was in control of everything. What he hadn't known, what he had never once thought to find out, was that 3 hours before he made that declaration, in front of the entire company, I had already signed my name to the thing he thought he owned. Not to take it from him, not to prove a point, but because someone had to, and I was the only person in the room who actually understood what it was worth saving. Here is what I want you to take from this story, because it isn't really about a corporate acquisition or a bad marriage. It's about what happens when you spend years building something in the background, building quietly, without credit, without recognition, and someone decides that because they can't see it, it must not exist. Spencer looked at me and saw someone he had outgrown. He never looked closely enough to see what I had actually been doing. That invisibility, which he intended as a punishment, turned out to be the condition that made everything possible. So if you are in a room right now where your work is being dismissed, where your name is being left off, the things you built, where someone is making you feel smaller than you are, keep building. Not for them, not to prove them wrong in some dramatic moment. Build because the work itself is worth doing, and because the day may come when what you built quietly is the only thing standing between everyone else and the consequences of someone else's arrogance. Power can take away a title. It cannot take away competence. And it cannot take back the papers you signed at 7:15 in the morning. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel. New stories go up every week, and I'd love for you to be here for the next one.